Over the next several years, settlers poured in. By 1830, some 15,000 Americans had settled in Texas. Austin is joined by Stephen's sister Emily, which brings him great pleasure, and by her husband and several children. So things seem to be going well until 1830, when a sort of, well, Austin described it as a lightning bolt from the blue fell, when following an inspection tour by a Mexican general named General Manuel Teran, the Mexican government took Teran's report and decided that it was time to clamp down on Anglo immigration. The result was the infamous Law of April 6, 1830, which attempted to cut off all immigration from the United States into Texas. It also would have placed more Mexican troops in Texas and tried to, in many ways, tie Texas closer to Mexico. Austin saw this as the potential death knell of his enterprise, because all of Austin's plans hinged upon the continuing large-scale immigration of Americans into Texas, which would create a market for Texas lands, which would lead to economic growth and development, all of which, of course, was based upon the idea of a booming cotton economy. In the meantime, about that same time, 1830, Mexico had abolished slavery in all of Mexico, and only through Austin's own political maneuverings had Texas barely been exempted from that ban on slavery. Slavery would become an increasingly difficult problem for Austin and the Texans to manage over the coming years. After 1830 and the infamous law of that year, it became more and more apparent to Austin that something had to be done to guarantee the status of the American colonists and really of Austin's plans. But there's more and more instability. In 1833, there's yet another revolution in Mexico, and a general named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna comes to power. Now, Santa Anna was a liberal, and Austin believed that he would be a reformer, that he would lift the ban on Anglo immigration, that Texas would gain more autonomy. But in the meantime, the idea of autonomy had really become a hot-button issue with many Anglo-Texans. In fact, in 1832 and 33, Anglo-Texans held two sort of ad hoc conventions aiming at framing their grievances and presenting them to the Mexican government. And certainly they wanted the Law of April 6, 1830 lifted. But even more important than that, they had, a new issue had become a sort of hot-button issue, and that was separate statehood for Texas. Texas had been attached to the Mexican state of Coahuila, into one state of Coahuila in Texas, ever since 1824. Texans believed that Texas should have its own independent state within the Mexican Union, which would then allow them to arrange many of their domestic institutions as they pleased, including, of course, the institution of slavery. And it would make it harder and harder for the central government in Mexico City to meddle with Texas affairs. After the second of these conventions in 1833, drafts its list of demands and even draws up a constitution for the state of Mexican Texas, the convention delegates elect Stephen F. Austin to take the petition and lay it before the Mexican government in Mexico City. Austin thought it was a bad idea. In fact, these conventions had been illegal under Mexican law, and he knew it. But he knew that he would be sort of left on the side of the road, so to speak, with his fellow Anglo-Texans if he didn't do their bidding. So he took the petition to Mexico City, laid it before the government, and got nowhere. The Santa Anna government had really just sort of consolidated power. They had a lot of bigger things on their mind than Texas. And several weeks passed and Austin got nowhere. Finally, in frustration, he wrote a letter back to his friends in the San Antonio Town Council, urging them to go ahead and take preliminary steps towards separating Texas from Coahuila on their own without approval of the government. Well, this was sedition, or maybe even treason, depending on how you looked at it. And when the letter arrived back in San Antonio, the San Antonio officials immediately turned it over to the federal government, and which apprehended Austin on his way back to Texas. He was turned around, taken under armed guard back to Mexico City, and thrown in a Mexican prison. Austin had a lot of time over the next few months to think about the relationship between Texas and Mexico. He was thrown in an old prison left over from the Spanish Inquisition. There's a picture of it, and there's an interior picture. It was an old convent converted into a prison. At first, he was literally in a dungeon with almost no light in it. After a few months, his conditions of incarceration were improved, and finally he was put under house arrest, and eventually after a year was released. But during that time, he had grown more convinced that Texas would never prosper long term under Mexican guidance. He's finally released under a sort of blanket amnesty for political prisoners, and in the spring of 1835 travels back to Texas. Back in Texas to find that his fellow Texans were in an advanced state of agitation. Santa Anna, in the meantime, had changed his political loyalties. He had done a 180-degree turn and gone from being a liberal reformer to being an arch conservative. He realized that the power of the Catholic Church, the power of the large landowners, and the power of the army particularly were on the side of conservatism and tradition, and rather than being overthrown or left behind, he decided to put himself at the head of that movement. He abolished the Mexican Constitution of 1824, abolished the Mexican states. Now Texas was not only not going to be its own state, there were no states. All of the states were put under the command of military leaders. And many states, including Texas, made preparation for military resistance. As Santa Anna puts himself at the head of a large army and marches northward to subdue Texas, to make sure Texas is in line, the Texans elect Austin to be general of the army, the so-called Army of the People. That was being created, a volunteer army being created to resist Santa Anna. Austin commanded the army for a few weeks in the field, but his health was very, very bad. He could barely climb up on a horse without help. He really wasn't a military man, and he was patriotic enough to know that he could be of more service to Texas in some other post, maybe a diplomatic post. And sure enough, he requested to be relieved. Ultimately, Sam Houston is placed in command of the Texas Army, and Austin is sent to the United States along with two other commissioners to solicit aid from the United States. Of course, the first shots of the revolution are finally fired at Gonzales in October of 1835. The war is on as Santa Anna arrives in Texas in early 1836. Austin arrives in the United States in early 1836 with his fellow commissioners William H. Wharton, who had been one of his bitterest political enemies in Texas, and a man named Dr. Branch Archer. The three men travel from New Orleans up to Louisville and then across the country, finally making their way to Washington, D.C., and finally to New York City. They make speeches and raise money. One of the things they try to do is solicit loans for the Texas cause. Of course, they're trying to inspire young men to travel to Texas and join the fight there too. They have a hard time in their mission because there's still no Declaration of Independence. Texas wouldn't declare independence, of course, until early March of 1836, and there was even no way to communicate that back to Austin and his fellow commissioners, even after the March Declaration. So Austin and his fellow commissioners have limited success in their mission to the United States, and they are in New York City when they learn the news that Sam Houston's army has smashed Santa Anna's force at the Battle of San Jacinto, and that Texas has won its independence. As soon as he hears the news, Austin hurries home to Texas. But the hero of San Jacinto, Sam Houston, is now the apple of the eye of many Texans. When an election to fill the office of president of the newly created Republic of Texas is held in September 1836, Austin runs, but 2 weeks before the election, the hero of San Jacinto enters the race, and Sam Houston wins in a landslide.